As the new year began, the 1st Marine Division occupied practically the same front it had held along line Minnesota for the last 3 months and would continue to hold for the next 2.5. The major units were dispersed from left to right on 1 January 1952 as follows. 1st KMC Regiment, Colonel Kim Dong-ha commanding, Lieutenant Alfred H. Marks, Senior Advisor. 1st Marines, Colonel Sidney S. Wade. 5th Marines, Colonel Frank P. Hager, Jr. 11th Marines, Colonel Bruce T. Hemphill in artillery support. The 7th Marines, Colonel John J. Wormuth, was in reserve until 10 January, when it relieved the 5th Marines on line. The regiment then went into reserve and could not be committed to action without the approval of 10 Corps. Tactical units not organic to the 1st Marine Division but attached at this time were, in addition to the 1st KMC Regiment, the 1st Korean Artillery Battalion, the 1st Platoon, 92nd U.S. Army Searchlight Company, and Battery C, 1st 4.5-inch Rocket Battalion. The new Korean Artillery Battalion consisted of 2 medium 155 mm and 2 light 105 mm howitzer batteries. Major Gerald C. Thomas, commanding general of the 1st Marine Division, approved a plan for placing this unit in the punchbowl on 9 January to reinforce Lieutenant Colonel Sherman W. Perry's 1st Battalion, 11th Marines. Enemy units opposing the 1st Marine Division up to 23 January 1952 were the 1st, 15th, and 47th NKPA Divisions, with an estimated combat strength of 25,750 men. On the 23rd, the 15th Division was relieved by the 45th. The enemy, according to the division report, showed greater caution than he had in previous months, and friendly outposts and ambuscades noted fewer contacts. His harassing mortar and artillery fires increased in volume through the month. Meanwhile, extensive efforts to improve his defenses continued, with particular attention being given to reverse slope installations. Ambush patrol on New Year's Eve. The new year was but a few minutes old when the 1st Marine action took place. Captain Charles W. McDonald's Baker Company had been directed by Lieutenant Colonel Kurt W. Norton, commanding the 1st Battalion 5th Marines, to send out an ambush patrol on New Year's Eve. A rifle squad, a light machine gun squad, an interpreter, and a corpsman composed the little column wearing white camouflage clothing which made the men all but invisible against a background of snow. After getting into position, the patrol settled down for the usual long wait. Darkness was the enemy's element, and Marine ambushers ran the risk of being ambushed themselves. This time, however, a 6-man North Korean patrol came within 5 yards before the Marines let the enemy have it with machine gun and rifle fire, which inflicted 1 KIA and 4 estimated WIA casualties. Efforts to take a prisoner were frustrated as the NKPA survivors melted away into the darkness. The Baker Company patrol returned without casualties at 0400. Marine operations were still limited by the USAC ceasefire directive, which went into effect for a month on 27 November 1951 in accordance with a decision reached during the armistice negotiations at Panmunjom. UN and Communist delegates agreed on a line of demarcation, known to the 8th Army as Line Duck. It linked up points of repeated USAC patrol contacts, not to exceed 2,000 yards beyond the MLR. Operations past this line, running generally parallel with Line Minnesota, could not be launched without permission from Corps commanders. When the agreement expired on 27 December, it was renewed indefinitely. Actually, it brought about few changes in the warfare of position which had replaced a warfare of movement on 20 September 1951. Each Marine Infantry Regiment on the MLR continued to send out several squad-sized patrols nightly for such purposes as ambush, reconnaissance, and taking prisoners. Raids were employed for special missions where formidable enemy resistance might be expected. These forces usually range from a platoon to a company in strength, reinforced by supporting weapons. Operations of this sort were planned with meticulous thoroughness and carried out with minimal risk. Marine raid in company strength. The first company-sized raid of the new year was conducted by units of the 3rd Battalion of the 1st Marines, Lieutenant Colonel Spencer H. Pratt, in the darkness of 1 to 2 January 1952. Captain James B. Ord Jr.'s Howe Company was alerted on 30 December to prepare for a night raid with the mission of reconnaissance and capturing or destroying any enemy that might be encountered. On the afternoon of the 30th, Ord made a preliminary reconnaissance with 2nd Lieutenant Milo J. C. and John E. Watson, commanding the 2nd and 3rd platoons respectively. That evening, the company commander held a briefing at his OP, observation post, which was attended by the sergeants and squad leaders of the 2 platoons selected for the raid. This command group carried out a second reconnaissance forward of the MLR on 31 December, proceeding until they ran into enemy sniper fire. Captain Ord requested aerial reconnaissance, and 3 missions were flown by observation planes of Major Kenneth C. Smedley's VMO-6. Line Duck and the assigned battalion sector limited the objective area. On a basis of these restrictions as well as reconnaissance reports, Ord recommended an operational area containing 3 objectives, each of which represented a point where the enemy was not likely to be encountered. These objectives were approved by Lieutenant Colonel Pratt and formed the basis of the battalion order. The task organization for the raid included 2 attached Howe Company units, the machine gun platoon minus and 60 mm mortar section, commanded by 2nd Lieutenants John D. Coutsandreas and James J. Hughes, respectively. Another infantry unit, the 1st Platoon of Item Company, 3-1, 2nd Lieutenant William E. Harper, was also attached. 1st Lieutenant Francis E. White, Howe Company Executive Officer, remained at the OP with the Tactical Air Control Party, which had an observation plane on strip alert in case the raiders ran into artillery or mortar fire. A forward air controller with radio man accompanied the raiding party, as well as artillery, 4.2-inch and 81 mm mortar forward observers. An interpreter, the assistant battalion surgeon, and a corpsman were included, and wiremen had the assignment of laying a line. Hill 812 was the jumping-off place for the column of files in ghostly white snowsuits with hoods. Boots were dark in contrast, but the snow was deep enough to hide them. The drift slowed up the wiremen, and an infantry fire team protected them at their work. The first objective consisted of bunkers and suspected mortar positions which had been reported by tactical air observers as recently occupied by the enemy. They were empty when the raiding party reached them, and the Marine column proceeded toward Objective 2, an ambush site overlooking and commanding a crossing of the Soyang Gang. The selected area for the support group was located nearby, and there the machine gun section and riflemen took positions on a nose with the wiremen, radiomen, and corpsmen in the center. While these elements peeled off, the raiding party continued toward the ambush site, where it was planned to lie in wait 2 hours for the enemy. A suspected minefield had to be crossed, and Captain Ord directed his men to advance in single file, stepping carefully in the footprints ahead. 12 Marines had passed safely when the 13th became the victim of a mine explosion. The corpsmen found broken bones, but none of the usual torn flesh and hemorrhaging, thanks to the new thermal boots issued during the winter of 1951 to 1952. The temperature was 0 with a sharp wind blowing. Some of the Marines had to shed clothing to keep the casualty warm during the forced immobility, and the raiding party commander broke radio silence by requesting permission of Captain Ord, in the support group area, to pull back to that position and set up the ambush. Permission was granted by Ord after radio consultation with the battalion commander on the Howe Company OP. The raiding party remained in ambush formation on Objective 2 for 2 hours without seeing or hearing an enemy. By that time, the condition of the mine casualty had deteriorated to such an extent that Lieutenant Colonel Pratt gave permission for a return to the MLR without proceeding to Objective 3. He directed that the raiders split and take two routes in the hope of capturing a prisoner, since a light enemy probing attack on the MLR had just been reported by Item Company of 3-1. This proved to be a fortunate decision, for two NKPA soldiers were seized. The main objective of the raid had thus been fulfilled, even though little action was seen during the 5-hour operation. Raids of this sort may seem anticlimactic when compared to the fights in the same area during the first 3 weeks of September, but the Marines were showing adaptability and conforming to a warfare of position that was contrary to all their offensive training. Careful reconnaissance, detailed planning, and minimal risks, these were the elements of defensive tactics in which large forces had to content themselves with small gains. Major General John T. Selden assumes command. On 11 January 1952, the 1st Marine Division had its second change of command in Korea when Major General John T. Selden relieved General Thomas. The new commanding general was born at Richmond, Virginia, and educated there at McGuire's University School. Before the United States entered World War I, he tried to join the Canadian Army but was warned that he would lose his American citizenship. In January 1915, at the age of 21, he enlisted as a private in the Marine Corps and saw 2 years of active duty on jungle patrols in Haiti. Commissioned as a second lieutenant in 1918, he served in ocean convoys during World War I. Sea duty, China duty, and more Haiti duty occupied him during the post-war years. The outbreak of World War II found him a scouting force Marine officer aboard the Indianapolis. After that, he had 3 main assignments: personnel and intelligence officer of 1st Marine Amphibious Corps, commanding officer of the 5th Marines in the New Britain operation, and chief of staff of the 1st Marine Division at Peleliu. Brigadier General William J. Whaling remained on duty as assistant division commander. The new staff officers were Colonel Richard G. Weed, chief of staff, Colonel Walter N. Flournoy, G1, Lieutenant Colonel James H. Tinsley, G2, Lieutenant Colonel Gordon D. Gale, G3, and Colonel Custis Burton, Jr., G4. A change of FMF PAC command had taken place on 1 January. Lieutenant General Franklin H. Hart relieved General Shepard, who became Commandant of the Marine Corps as General Cates finished his 4-year term. General Hart paid his first visit to the 1st Marine Division late in January. The new FMF PAC commander found the Marines occupying essentially the same positions they had defended since late September. About 2/3 of the 12.25-mile MLR on line Minnesota was good defensive ground. It had been strengthened by an elaborate system of trenches and bunkers behind miles of barbed wire. In the left central portion of the Marine sector, the enemy held the dominating terrain. This was particularly true of the rugged area just west of Hill 812, where the opposing trenches were only 50 to 150 yards apart. There, a fire-raked landmark, known to the Marines as Luke the Gook's Castle, had been made into a strong point by the enemy. Its base was a maze of trenches and bunkers, and the 20-foot granite knob could have been taken only at an excessive cost in casualties. Although this bastion was hit repeatedly by almost every type of supporting ordnance, it was never completely destroyed nor denied to the enemy. Operations of trench warfare had inevitably shaken down into a daily routine of sniping by day and patrols or raids by night. Marine artillery, mortars, and stationary tank fire, occasionally reinforced by naval guns, played an increasingly important part in the coordinated destruction of NKPA defenses. As a result, the enemy was limited for the most part to well-camouflaged reverse slope positions. Because of the 1st Marine Division's defensive mission and the constant rotation of the more experienced personnel back to the United States, it was considered that men assigned to infantry elements, in particular, needed additional training in small unit leadership and offensive tactics. Consequently, the regiments were rotated at monthly intervals to the reserve area near Wangtong Ni, where Camp Tripoli had been established for training. An average of 84 NCOs a week completed a 168-hour special course of instruction over a 4-week period. The program for the rank and file was so intensive, according to one report, that it was considered a relief by some Marines to cease training and return to the relatively quiet life on the front lines. The truce talks at Panmunjom continued to influence operations at the front. A demilitarized zone having been proposed in anticipation of an armistice, preparations were begun by the 1st Marine Division to develop the defenses along Line Iceland, generally conforming to the Line Kansas of Marine fights early in September. It was to be used as a new line of defense if the UN and communist delegates reached an agreement. Perhaps because other offensive tactics were so curtailed, psychological warfare had its heyday in the winter months of 1952. Propaganda leaflets were dropped from planes or fired by 105mm howitzers. At vantage points along the front, loudspeakers bombarded the communists with surrender appeals in their own language. The effects could not be evaluated with any degree of certainty, but it was hoped that the enemy did not respond with the amused indifference shown by the Marines toward red propaganda. Boots, combat, rubber, insulated. The average low temperature for January 1952 was 11 degrees Fahrenheit. This was mild weather as compared to the sub-zero readings of the previous winter. Only 10 slight frostbite cases were reported for the month in contrast to 3,083 non-battle casualties, nearly all frostbite cases, incurred during the 2 weeks, 27 November to 10 December 1950, of the Chosin Reservoir breakout. The improvement in January 1952 could not be credited entirely to more clement weather. It was due in greater measure to one of the most noteworthy innovations of the Korean War, the insulated rubber combat boot, which proved much superior to the shoe pack of the past winter. U.S. Army experiments dated back to 1944. They were dropped 3 years later after efforts to perfect a boot with sealed insulation failed to meet the test of long marches. The Navy had more promising results with the boot during the winter of 1948 to 1949 when Arctic clothing tests were conducted at Point Barrow, Alaska. Army and Navy tests at Mount Washington, New Hampshire the following winter were inconclusive. Marine Corps tests were held during the first 4 months of 1951 at the following places: MCEB Quantico, Fort Churchill, Manitoba, Big Delta, Alaska, Pickle Meadows, California, and the Naval Medical Field Research Laboratory, NMFRL, Camp Lejeune. In addition to engineering tests, states the Marine Report, the insulated rubber boots have been worn by test subjects selected from a variety of backgrounds, under conditions of activity varying from strenuous marching for 20 miles to complete immobility, in ambient temperatures from 58 degrees to minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit, over terrain ranging from soft snow to hard snow, ice, sand, rocky ground, mud, gravel, water, and iced river banks, for periods of time corresponding to a normal working day and more than 72 hours. As now constructed, the insulated rubber boot, employing the vapor barrier principle, meets the requirements outlined previously and is satisfactory for use by Marine Corps ground forces in cold climate areas, supplanting the shoe-pack combination. The distinguishing feature of the thermal boot, as it came to be popularly known, is an airspace between the inner and outer layers of wool pile insulation, both of which are completely sealed off by latex from any contact with moisture. This airspace, under pressure, produces a vapor barrier such that heat cannot readily escape when it is emitted from the foot. Thus the wearer of the boot supplies his own warmth, which is retained as long as he is active, regardless of prevailing temperatures. If, however, the walls of the airspace are punctured and the insulation becomes wet, The moisture collected within the boot freezes at low temperatures if the wearer remains inactive. In such cases, severe frostbite may result. Some of the tests were spectacular. One subject poured water containing pieces of ice into his boots and donned frozen socks before putting on the footgear. After 10 minutes of walking, the ice in the boots had turned to warm water, and there was no harmful effect on the man. Another subject waded across a knee-deep creek at a temperature of 0. Before he had marched a mile in the snow, his feet had warmed the water in the boots, although his pants were frozen so stiff he could scarcely walk. Seldom has a military innovation been tested so thoroughly and scientifically in such a short time. Colonels Eon M. Bethel and John F. Stam of Marine Corps Headquarters took a leading part in the development and procurement phases along with Lieutenant Colonel Gordon A. Hardwick. Major Vernon D. Boyd and Captain David R. McGrew, Jr. were active in the troop acceptance tests. A good many bugs had to be eliminated before the boot met with complete Marine approval. The manufacturer's modifications were effected with minimal delay. It is perhaps needless to add that the thermal boot was not foolproof. Protection continued in sub-zero weather for at least an hour after the termination of activity, but it was inviting frostbite to remain motionless much longer. Socks had to be changed every 12 hours, and foot cleanliness and hygiene could not be neglected. If a few such simple rules were observed, a man had virtually perfect frostbite protection in the coldest weather. In fact, it was seriously proposed that a Marine casualty of this sort should be charged with misconduct if he acquired his frostbite while provided with thermal boots and a change of socks. In view of the tests and negotiations with the manufacturers, it was a marvel of promptness when the first shipment of boots reached the 1st Marine Division in August 1951, long before the advent of cold weather. Distribution to the division was completed by 15 November. Throughout the winter, the experience of all units concerned was reported to division headquarters. And in a memorandum of 26 August 1952 to the Commandant, General Selden expressed his approval. The boot, rubber, insulated, is considered an excellent item of cold weather equipment. It is far superior to the shoe pack. The acceptance by the rank and file went so far that the Mickey Mouse boot, as it was sometimes dubbed, acquired a reputation for protecting the wearer against anti-personnel mines. Some wounds apparently were reduced in severity by this protection, but it could not be claimed that the boot qualified as armor. Production by the manufacturer kept pace with division and air wing requirements in Korea. By 14 December 1951, about 90,000 pairs of boots and 2,000 patching kits had been received at San Francisco, more than enough to take care of the 6,500 pairs needed monthly for resupply under combat conditions. The thermal boot was here to stay. Winter operations in Korea. 500 armored vests flown to Korea. Marine body armor was just then about to meet its first large-scale test in the field. It had cleared its preliminary hurdle during the test from 14 June to 13 October 1951, when a joint Army-Navy Medical Commission endorsed 40 vests worn in action by troops of the 5th Marines and 2 Army infantry regiments. On 9 November, at Marine Corps Headquarters, Marine officers were briefed on the successful results in Korea by the 2 Navy officers who helped supervise the tests, Commander John S. Cowan, Medical Corps, U.S. Navy, and Lieutenant Commander Frederick J. Lewis, MSc, U.S. Navy. That same day, the commanding general of FMF PAC stated an operational requirement for 500 armored vests to be sent to the 1st Marine Division. And on 16 November, the Commandant approved the standardization and procurement of vests to be designed by the Naval Medical Field Research Laboratory at Camp Lejeune and airshipped to Korea not later than 31 January 1952. So many problems remained to be solved that it was nip and tuck whether Lieutenant Commander Lewis and his NMFRL colleagues would make the deadline. On 11 December 1951, another body armor meeting was held at Marine Corps headquarters, attended by Marine representatives. Lieutenant Commander Lewis and Mr. John F. Quinlan, reporting for the NMFRL, explained that as a consequence of changes in design to speed up manufacture, samples submitted to them weighed as much as 10 pounds. Under no circumstances, said Lewis, would he approve a vest weighing more than 8 pounds, since its success depended so much on troop acceptance. Despite the fact that only a few weeks remained before the deadline, Lewis exhibited a vest that he and Quinlan had redesigned by working around the clock until the armor came within the weight limit without any sacrifice in protection. That vest was immediately put into production as the M1951. A plastic fiber manufacturer agreed to supply 70,000 Doron plates, and a Philadelphia sportswear company contracted to manufacture the first 500 vests, plus an additional 2,500 to be delivered by 30 March 1952. The M1951 was described in Marine reports as a zippered, vest-type, sleeveless jacket constructed of water-resistant nylon incorporating two types of armor. One, a flexible pad of basket-weave nylon, covers the upper chest and shoulder girdle. The other, overlapping curved Doron plates, covers the lower chest, back, and abdomen. These Doron plates consist of several layers of fiberglass cloth, bonded or laminated together with a resin. Although the ballistic properties of the flexible pads of basket weave nylon and the Doron plates are virtually the same, by using the rigid plates where flexibility is not mandatory, the problem of protrusion and the resultant wounds under the armor is reduced. Marine wearers of the M1951 were warned that it would not stop rifle or machine gun bullets unless they had lost much of their velocity at long ranges. The vest was protection against most grenade, mortar, and artillery fragments, as well as .45 caliber pistol and burp gun slugs of less than 1,000 feet per second initial muzzle velocity. Wearers did not escape entirely unscathed, for the impact of the fragment or slug left painful bruises. It was a close squeak, but the first 500 vests reached Korea with only a few days to spare. Captain David R. McGrew, Jr. accompanied the shipment as project officer with the mission of supervising and observing the use made of the M1951 in action. His first letter to Headquarters Marine Corps, dated 4 February 1952, commented that, up to tonight we have had 9 men hit while wearing the vest. 1 killed outright as a 120mm mortar round landed right in his lap. However, the other 8 showed excellent results. All of the 8 were wounded in other places not covered by the vest, but they were all WIA instead of KIA. Captain McGrew cited the instance of a PFC of the 2nd Battalion 7th Marines, wounded by the explosion of an 82mm mortar shell only 15 feet in front of him. He received several fragments in the face and his leg was fractured, but there were some 45 holes in his vest without any penetrations. 15 of the fragments had been large enough to inflict mortal chest or abdomen wounds. The 500 vests were issued only to troops in particularly hazardous situations, such as patrols to the enemy lines. Upon returning from a patrol or raid, the wearers turned in their armor to be worn by other Marines under fire. The reaction of the user to the vest, reported McGrew, is closely related to the amount of enemy activity. In sectors of the OPLR and MLR, outposts and main lines of resistance, where heavy incoming mortar and artillery fire was received, there were no complaints regarding the weight or restrictive features of the vest. In other sectors where there was little or no enemy activity, approximately 15% of the personnel complained that the vest was heavy and restricted movement to some degree. Approximately 2% of the wearers in these sectors thought the vest was not worth the trouble and would wear it only when ordered to do so. The project officer believed that a significant reduction in KIA casualties could be credited to the M1951, but that WIA figures were only slightly lessened. That was because so many wearers were wounded who would have been killed save for the armor. Captain McGrew listed the following case histories, confirmed by medical officers. Men who would have been killed instead of wounded if they had lacked armor protection, 23. Men who had potentially severe wounds reduced to superficial wounds, 29. Men who had superficial wounds prevented altogether, 31. The project officer had no opportunity to compare the casualties of vest wearers with those of an equal number of unprotected Marines taking part in the same action. It was his conclusion, based on observation, that use of the vest by all personnel who are habitually forward of battalion command posts may result in as much as a 30% reduction in battle casualties. Because many WIA cases are the result of wounds of the extremities and/or multiple wounds, there probably will not be a large reduction of casualties in this category. It is believed that the largest reduction will occur in the KIA category and that this reduction will be substantial. The introduction of body armor was not heralded in the press by page 1 headlines such as had announced the first transport helicopter operations in Korea. Occasionally, a photograph on page 8 showed a Marine grinning triumphantly while pointing to a hole in his armored vest and holding aloft the jagged mortar fragment that might otherwise have killed him. But it is safe to say that a majority of stateside newspaper readers and radio listeners in 1951 were unaware of the Marine revival of armor adapted to 20th century warfare. Press correspondents in Korea did not appear to grasp the tactical significance of an innovation which they regarded entirely as a humanitarian achievement. From a strictly military viewpoint, however, it was apparent that if the M1951 could reduce casualties by 30%, as Captain McGrew estimated, and his estimate was later regarded as conservative, it would mean that a like reduction had been effected in the destructive potential of the enemy's best anti-personnel weapons. It was as if the Marines were able to slip behind the enemy's lines and silence 3 out of 10 of his howitzers, mortars, burp guns, and grenades. This was of particular importance in overcoming the numerical superiority of the Communists. Not only did each American wound casualty reduce the effectiveness of the unit, but 4 or more comrades were often neutralized as stretcher bearers in Korean mountain terrain. If body armor could prevent 3 casualties out of 10, therefore, it would be a significant addition to a unit's numerical strength as well as combat morale. Any doubts about Marine troop acceptance of the M1951 were laid to rest by the approval of the 500 vests issued early in February 1952. An additional 2,500 arrived early in March, and on the 13th of that month the division ordered 25,000 more. The armored vest, like the thermal boot, had needed only a thorough trial to become standard equipment. Helicopter operations Mule Train and Changey. The combat helicopter, oldest of the 3 Marine tactical innovations in Korea, had already managed to make routine performances out of operations that once claimed headlines. Battalion troop lifts were no longer a novelty, and supplying a frontline company by air was taken for granted. But nothing quite as ambitious as Operation Mule Train had ever been attempted, the mission of completely supplying a battalion on the MLR for a week with a daily average of 4 helicopters. Hill 884 was again the objective. Colonel Keith B. McCutcheon's HMR 161 was given the task of flying tentage, stoves, rations, and ammunition from supply dumps to the 1st Battalion of the 1st Marines, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel John E. Gorman. It was the first opportunity for HMR 161 to try out improvements in helicopter flying crane techniques credited to Major Charles E. Cornwell. He had adapted the underslung nets, controlled manually from the cabin, which did a better job than the pallet or portable platform for many types of cargo. An average altitude of 2,300 feet for the 5 landing places made it necessary to reduce the payload to 850 pounds. Yet HMR 161 handled the assignment during the first week of 1952 with about one-third of its aircraft, while the remainder went about routine chores. So well did 4 helicopters keep ahead of schedule that sometimes they flew in more cargo than could be immediately unloaded at the objectives. Following are the statistics of the 7 days. Pounds lifted, 150,730. Hours of flight time, 91.7. Loads lifted, 219. Average of miles flown, 9.6. 3 days later, Operation Changey began on 10 January 1952. Like Operation Bumblebee 3 months earlier, this was a battalion relief lift. Yet it differed from its predecessors in that troops were to be flown from Field X-83 to sites on the company instead of battalion level, the former being only 200 yards behind the front line. In December, the loading zone and landing site duties formerly assigned to a platoon of the 1st Shore Party Battalion were taken over by the 1st Air Delivery Platoon, Service Command, FMF PAC. First Lieutenant William A. Rivas and 35 enlisted men had a mission to prepare and deliver supplies by air, whether by parachute, air freight, or helicopter. These specialists were in charge during Operation Changey when the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, Lieutenant Colonel Edward G. Kurdziel, relieved Lieutenant Colonel Norton's 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. The operation was conducted smoothly by helicopters flying in defilade throughout the approach, landing, and return phases. Operation Mousetrap, from 14 to 17 January, was planned primarily as a test of the ability of HMR 161 to launch an anti-guerrilla attack on short notice. Colonel McCutcheon and Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell were alerted at 0100 in regard to a 2-company lift schedule for 1000 that same morning. With only minor difficulties, they transported 500 Marines to a landing site cleared by the Air Delivery Platoon. 3 similar troop movements were completed by HMR 161 during the next 3 days. If ever a bronze plaque is awarded in commemoration of the first history-making helicopter troop and supply lifts, it would be fitting to install it on Hill 884. That bleak and roadless height had its 5th large-scale operation on 24 February when Lieutenant Colonel Harold C. Howard's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines relieved the 2nd Battalion of that same regiment on Mount Helicopter. Operation Rotate was completed without incident as further evidence that battalion reliefs by helicopter were now routine. In spite of the demands made upon HMR 161 helicopters in cold weather and mountainous terrain, it is noteworthy that no serious mechanical defects had developed. This 6-month record came to an end on 24 February 1952 when Captain John R. Irwin was returning from Seoul to X-83. Warned by alarming vibrations, he landed to discover that the broken remnants of the tail assembly had dropped behind him in the snow. 4 days later, while flying a load of logs for bunkers, Captain Calvin G. Alston's aircraft was so shaken by vibrations that he suspected damage from enemy artillery fragments. He made a forced landing in the snow only to discover another instance of a tail assembly breakdown. Colonel McCutcheon grounded all HMR 161 aircraft until the trouble could be corrected. Not until 14 March, after 16 modified tail assemblies had been flown to Korea, did the Marine Transport Helicopter Squadron take to the air again. The 5 days of Operation Clam Up. Ground operations continued with little change during February and the first 2 weeks of March. The only departure from the well-worn tactical norm came on 10 February, when USAC put Operation Clam Up into effect across the entire UN front. The purpose was to feign a withdrawal and lure the enemy into sending out patrols which would yield prisoners to 8th Army units. A USAC letter of instruction, dated 4 February 1952, asserted that a policy of aggressive patrolling has led the enemy to rely upon our patrols for the maintenance of contact. This situation enables him to maintain contact without subjecting his troops to the hazard of capture or casualty. All corps were directed to attempt to decoy the enemy into dispatching patrols against our lines and ambush and capture such patrols. 1st Marine Division orders called for an elaborate series of deceptions. Immediately prior to clam up, on 9 to 10 February, the 11th Marines fired 471 harassing and interdiction missions, as if to cover a large-scale withdrawal. Over 12,000 artillery rounds were expended. Then clam up commenced, and the 3 regiments on the MLR, from left to right, the KMCs, 1st Marines, and 7th Marines, did their part to hoodwink the enemy. Reserve battalions executed daylight marches on foot to the rear and returned after dark by means of motor lifts. The 5th Marines and Division Reserve at Camp Tripoli executed similar feigned withdrawals. After the Marine cannoneers completed their supposed covering fires, the front was plunged into an eerie silence. It did not take long, of course, for the enemy's curiosity to be aroused. NKPA patrols reconnoitered the Marine lines on the night of 10 to 11 February without being fired upon. The following night, a patrol attempted to draw Marine fire in the Hill 812 area by advertising its presence with loud talk. The enemy's fire was not returned until the patrol attacked a Marine position with white phosphorus grenades. In sheer self-defense, the Marines retaliated, and the North Koreans made a hurried exit, leaving behind 10 dead and 2 wounded men who became prisoners. At first light on the 12th, another enemy patrol tried to penetrate the wire in front of a 1st Marines position and paid the penalty with 9 men killed and 3 wounded in a 15-minute firefight. On 13 February, the Marines were pounded with the month's heaviest concentration of NKPA fire, 344 artillery and 1,469 mortar rounds. Thus did the enemy serve notice of his realization that Marine positions on the MLR were being held in strength. NKPA patrol actions on the nights of the 13th and 14th were launched at Marine trenches on hills 812 and 854 at the estimated cost of heavy casualties. When Operation Clam Up came to an end on 15 February, it had admittedly fallen short of USAC expectations. Although NKPA patrol losses had been considerable, they were offset by fewer casualties in rear areas enjoying a 5-day immunity from UN artillery fire. Worse yet, the enemy was enabled during this period of grace to bring up ammunition and other supplies without interference. As a final disillusionment, it was reckoned that across the whole 8th Army front the Communists had lost fewer prisoners than during the preceding 5-day period. In the Marine combat zone, a gain was recorded in enemy casualties. General Selden congratulated the division on the fire discipline practiced by MLR troops and by platoon and company commanders. As a consequence of the fire discipline, the line companies were able to kill 56 enemy and wound 54. These totals, it was pointed out, were larger than the losses normally inflicted on the enemy in a 5-day period. On the other hand, 5 deserters from the mortar company of the 1st Battalion 91st Regiment 45th NKPA Division revealed that advantage had been taken of Operation Clam Up by detailing mortar personnel and men from the rifle companies to carry ammunition. During the 5-day lull, according to the prisoners, 2,600 rounds were brought up for the company's 9 mortars. After the brief flurry of Operation Clam Up, the front quickly settled down to its old routine of patrols. An average of 8 Marine night ambush patrols and 5 daylight reconnaissance patrols forward of the MLR was maintained. The results left much to be desired. Of the last 110 ambuscades and 75 reconnaissance patrols reported in February, only 1 of the former and 6 of the latter claimed contacts. All but 1 of the contacts had negligible results. The Marine fire attack did the enemy more damage. Artillery fired 679 observed missions during the month, 211 on troops, 175 on bunkers, 121 on mortars, 96 on artillery, and 75 on such miscellaneous targets as OPs, vehicles, machine guns, and supply points. This total was recorded in spite of an ammunition shortage, which would ultimately become the subject of debate in Congress. Even with supplies of ammunition limited by 10 Corps orders, Marine artillery drove the enemy from untenable forward slope positions to underground fortifications on the reverse slope. Naval gunfire was limited by the extreme range of the division's zone of action. Only large targets forward and to the right of center could be taken under fire. Even so, the Wisconsin and the St. Paul scored some devastating hits in February on enemy reverse slope positions. On one occasion, the Wisconsin erroneously calculated its deflection. Two 16-inch rounds landed between the front line and the 3-7 mortar positions before the fire could be stopped. Fortunately, no one was injured. The Wisconsin Marine officer happened to be visiting the division CP that day, and on hearing the news he came up to 3-7 and collected a large shell fragment. He stated that he intended to mount the jagged piece of steel in the ship's CIC room as a reminder to future gunners to make no errors in plot. Observed direct fire by the 90mm rifles of the 1st Tank Battalion, Major Walter E. Reynolds, Jr., continued to be effective against NKPA bunkers and gun emplacements. Utilizing the high ground along the MLR, particularly on hills 812 and 854, tanks sniped at the enemy both by day and night. This was made possible by the powerful lights of a platoon from the 92nd U.S. Army Searchlight Company, attached to the 11th Marines. The mountainous terrain in East Korea was not particularly suited to artificial moonlight, the indirect illumination of a large area which results from bouncing the rays of searchlights off low-lying clouds. But direct illumination permitted aimed 90mm fire in the darkness and had the further advantage of blinding the enemy to the tanks themselves as well as to troop movements behind them. Not a single light was shot out during the winter in spite of persistent NKPA attempts. The lessons taught by battlefield illumination in Korea were to be incorporated into 2 instructive bulletins after the war. "The enemy does not have any better night vision than we do," asserted USMC Landing Force Bulletin No. 6. "No racial or national group of people has any inherent physical advantage over another as to capability for seeing in darkness. The apparent advantage which the enemy sometimes displays in night operations is due only to a difference in training. In the case of the Oriental soldier, or the Eskimo, for example, training usually begins early in life, where he does not have the convenience of artificial light to the degree we have, and has been forced to make maximum use of his natural night vision in many of his normal activities. U.S. forces have conducted many successful night operations after adequate training. Some units have reported that after intensive night training, personnel have become so proficient that they sometimes prefer night operations to daylight operations." In support of this conclusion, records for the winter of 1951 to 1952 reveal that the Marines held their own very well in the night combats of No Man's Land, where the outcome depended upon immediate decisions based upon seeing in the dark. Marine casualties for February, the last full month in East Korea, were 23 KIA, 102 WIA, and 1 MIA, including the KMC Regiment. Enemy losses were reported as 174 counted and 381 estimated KIA, 606 estimated WIA, and 63 prisoners. After a winter of positional warfare, the Marines could recall with better understanding the tales their fathers had told them about France in World War I. For history was staging one of its repetitions, and, allowing for improvements in weapons, The trenches of Korea in 1951 to 1952 differed but slightly from the trenches of the Western Front in 1917 to 1918.